So, you're planning on doing a video about the new wave of British heavy metal, huh? Yep. Got any ideas for your intro? I mean, you usually like to put some kind of intro into your videos. Goofy as they usually are.
No, hadn't thought about it. Just go ahead and start the video. No introduction this time.
Well, I mean, you could do something, right? I mean, you could do like, introduce the video with a funny British accent or something like that.
Like what? Like,
I don't know. You can come up with something. Try right now. Give it a shot. What you got? Give me your best British accent.
well, what? Like,
Morning, governor. Spot of tea for you.
they'll never suspect that one. We'll catch them completely by surprise.
Mr. Potter, Mr. Weasley, whatever are you doing in the girls' washroom? Get back to your room in Gryffindor.
I'm sure you'll find it quite to your satisfaction.
What's on the telly? It's a penguin. What's a penguin doing on the telly? Exploding.
No, that's not necessary. We're perfectly fine without it. We don't need one of those.
Look, you come around here asking for a quid. I told you many times, I haven't got any more money. Yeah, you know what? Maybe just skip the intro and just go straight into the video. I think that's best.
Greetings, music fans. This is Music is a Journey. I'm Peter Scove, and yes, I'm wearing goofy sunglasses today. Reason being is I was vacuum cleaning the house earlier today, and I seem to have disturbed a lot of dust. It has set off my allergies. My eyes are a bit red, and I might be editing this video frequently as I pause for sneezing and nose blowing. You don't want to see that. So I was thinking about whether or not I would actually make a video for the new wave of British heavy metal. It is, of course, an extremely important part in the history of heavy metal because it basically saw the revival and kind of rebirth, regeneration of heavy metal around 1979-1980. And there are just so many different topics I was thinking to do this year because this year we've decided marks the 50th anniversary of heavy metal, counting from the release of Black Sabbath's debut album back in February 1970. We can talk about what happened before that, exactly when did heavy metal really start, but basically it seems that the metal community has more or less decided that Black Sabbath's debut album is a suitable birthday. Alright, so yeah, I had a lot of topics I wanted to talk about this year. I'm limited for how many videos I can make, usually one, possibly two a month, and that's about it. However, it just so happened that I caught a video on the Sea of Tranquility YouTube channel with Pete Pardo and Martin Popoff talking about their favorite new wave of British heavy metal albums. And then shortly after that, I watched an episode of Banger TV where they were discussing which was the most significant year in the history of heavy metal. And there seemed to be a really strong leaning towards 1983-84 with Martin Popoff shooting for 83 or possibly 1980. And I was really thrilled about that because I'd already made my video about heavy metal in 1983 and what an important year it was. But in the end, it seemed that the three members of the program all decided to go with 1980. And of course, 1980 sees the new wave of British heavy metal just bam right out there. So that's what we're going to talk about today then. Earlier this year, I made videos about the state of heavy metal music in 1977 and another one about what was happening in the scene in 1983. In the intervening years, probably the most significant thing that happened in heavy metal was the so-called new wave of British heavy metal. The new wave of British heavy metal. That's quite a mouthful to say, and it has actually been abbreviated to NWoBHM, or as it is sometimes just pronounced, NWoBHM. NWoBHM. Okay, it doesn't roll off the tongue as smoothly as laser or scuba, but I'm going to try to just say NWoBHM from time to time throughout this video so I don't have to say the whole thing all at once. Anyway, basically, the NWoBHM scene happened between 1979 and 1983. Of course, there were actually bands forming years before 1979. There were even a couple of albums that were managed to squeak out before 1979. I did mention in my 1977 video that Quartz, one of the new wave of British heavy metal bands, NWoBHM bands, released their debut album in 1977. And of course there were other bands that managed to squeak out an album around 1984 or so, but basically from 1979 to 1983 was when the scene was at its hottest. And indeed, Martin Popoff has written 2 books, one talking about the beginning of the scene and one talking about the end of the scene. He has also written a book about various albums and that. So if you want to check it out, check out Martin Popoff's books on the new wave of British heavy metal if you want to read more. The Wikipedia article is pretty detailed as well. So I became interested in rock music sometime around 1982 when I was 11 years old, and by 1983 I had fallen in love with the sound of heavy metal. That means I dropped into the NWoBHM scene just as it was coming to an end, and so I missed all of the excitement of those bands first reaching the North American shores. For me, heavy metal was just simply what it was all about, and that meant I had some NWoBHM bands like Iron Maiden, Def Leppard, and Saxon in my collection early on, but I also had some of the older boys like Black Sabbath, Judas Priest, the new American bands like Quiet Riot, Motley Crue, Rat, Twisted Sister, and a bunch of Canadian bands like Lee Aaron, Helix, and Kick-Axe. There were also international bands like Scorpions and Accept from Germany, Crocus from Switzerland, and Loudness from Japan, and of course, not really heavy metal, more hard rock, but they fall in there anyway, AC/DC from Australia. In the Pete Pardo Martin Popoff video, Martin describes driving down to Spokane, Washington with his buddies and checking out records, picking up a lot of the British bands as the albums were freshly released. By the time my best friend and I were old enough to catch a bus to downtown Vancouver and check out some of the larger and more varied stores that were down there, the whole extreme metal movement of the 80s was on, and I was picking up fresh releases by the likes of Bathory, Possessed, Creator, Omen, Ruthless, Razor, and Sacrifice. I wasn't even aware of the term new wave of British heavy metal until years later, and even then my knowledge of the NWoBHM bands, really having fun saying that, was limited to just a few. It was only a few years ago that I decided to find out which bands were actually part of the scene, and I even ordered several albums of bands that I had never heard of. So to watch Pete Pardo's video was really fun for me since I had nearly all of the albums mentioned, and even if I didn't partake in the enjoyment of the music in real time as those 2 gentlemen had done, I could at least relate to the music of which they spoke, and as well as the experience of going to a record store and seeking out the heavy metal section and perusing the album covers, deciding which ones looked intriguing enough to bring home. Because a lot of the fun in discovering music in the pre-internet days was the gamble of purchasing something based on the cover alone. And that is still something I do from time to time these days, although I'm more likely to check out how the music sounds on YouTube before actually making the purchase. Of course, since most of the albums I have in my collection are fairly new to me, I only got them within the last 3 years or so, my perspectives will not be as well defined as Martin and Pete's. There's a big difference between talking about an album that you listened to over and over again when you were 14, 15 years old, and an album you've only heard a few times in the last couple of years. Nevertheless, I want to share what's in my collection. Before we get started, I want to talk about 3 bands that basically they were there and they were around and active at the time of the new wave of British heavy metal, and they were actually doing very well for themselves for the most part. However, they are not really new wave of British heavy metal bands. The first one I'd like to talk about, the most obvious one, is Judas Priest. Of course, Judas Priest really began to rise in popularity during the years of the new wave of British heavy metal scene. The band already had a long history with its original incarnation going back to 1969, and the version that included KK Downing and Ian Hill had begun sometime in the early 1970s. It was Judas Priest's new sound, which they brought out on their second album in 1976, Sad Wings of Destiny, that probably inspired a lot of the new wave of British heavy metal bands who were just forming around that time. But, of course, Judas Priest were from a different era, so even though their albums, especially British Steel, and as well albums like Screaming for Vengeance and so on, they were released during the time of the new wave of British heavy metal, and Judas Priest are a British band, but they are not part of that scene. Then there's Gillan. Ian Gillan formed the band after quitting his own Ian Gillan Band, which started out as a more jazz fusion band. Though Gillan's debut album, Mr. Universe, was released in October of '79, the band was obviously of an older generation. Ian Gillan had been singing in bands professionally since the early 60s, joining Episode 6 in 1965, and later left with bandmate Roger Glover for Deep Purple in 1969. The Gillan drummer, Mick Underwood, had been playing with Ritchie Blackmore in the Outlaws way back in the early 60s, and also was the final drummer for Episode 6 around the time that Ian Gillan and Roger Glover had left. So this was a band with professional experience that already covered almost 2 decades. In addition, they were of the old school hard rock class, which included keyboards, in this case played by the very talented Colin Towns. Being British and playing hard and heavy rock in 1979 meant that the music of Gillan could be included among other British bands, though there were differences. I do think it was Pete Pardo in that Sea of Tranquility video who mentioned a Gillan album in his list, with of course the note that Gillan probably could be excluded simply because, as I said, the band was new but the members were old with lots of years of experience behind them. Okay, speaking of bands that formed a little bit earlier on and had lots of experience, there is Motorhead. Motorhead is the closest of the 3 bands to being a true member of the new wave of British heavy metal, basically because they formed around the time that other bands were only just starting out. But Motorhead were very quick to begin recording because the members already had experience. Lemmy Kilminster, he had already been playing in Hawkwind for a few years, and I believe I saw a video on YouTube of him on stage performing and singing as far back as 1969. So again, we're talking about a band that had experience. However, Motorhead did actually record their first album in 1976, which was, the release was delayed, and it was 1977 when they released their first album. They did have that new sound. They had a kind of punk rock edge and aggressiveness to them, the rougher vocals, bringing in the rock and roll sound, the heavy hard rock sound, and a bit of that punk vibe as well. So they fit in the scene very nicely. And in fact, the other day I was listening to a playlist of NWoBHM bands on shuffle, and I think it was after Quartz and Tigers of Pantang, Motorhead came on with the song Metropolis from Overkill, and at first I didn't even notice. It wasn't until the vocals came in I thought, oh, yeah, that's Motorhead, wow. So some people regard Motorhead as being part of the NWoBHM scene, whereas other people say they actually were around a little bit early on, so not really quite part of it. I'm one of the people who say, yeah, but no, but yeah, but no, but yeah, whatever that's supposed to mean. But basically I see it as that Motorhead already started 75, 76. Motorhead was going to happen anyway, regardless of Iron Maiden, Def Leppard, and Raven, and whatever else you want to say. Motorhead was going to happen. It just so happened that at the time they started to come in popularity, the new wave of British heavy metal scene took off. And so bands like Motorhead and Gillan and Judas Priest and even Black Sabbath, who experienced a kind of revival after Ozzy Osbourne left and Dio came in, Ozzy Osbourne's debut album, all those British bands managed to just ride in on that wave, and it was all around good luck and success for everyone. Now that that lengthy preamble is out of the way, I just want to mention a little bit about the term new wave of British heavy metal. Basically, music journalist Jeff Barton gets credit for it. However, I read that it was not him exactly. It was not he who coined the phrase, but rather his editor, and then he popularized it through his writing. And in fact, he used it as often as possible, basically to create the impression that there was a movement happening. Although Mr. Barton himself says he doesn't really consider it a movement, because within all those bands there was such a diversity of sounds. It wasn't really like one unified approach. And we'll get into that as I talk about the different albums. So the usage of new wave also recognizes that there was a previous wave of heavy metal bands from the UK. This, of course, refers to the first wave that began in 1969 and continued through to around 1972 with bands like Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, Deep Purple, Uriah Heep, Budgie, Humble Pie, UFO, Nazareth, and many others. At the time, however, of course, the term heavy metal was only just being applied by the music press and did not really become popular in the music press yet. In fact, that didn't really start to happen until around 1974-75, as I mentioned in a previous video. And at that time there, heavy metal had kind of become passé, and it was more progressive rock or hard rock which was taking over, and the hard rock bands were then being labeled as heavy metal. So you would hear that used for bands like Aerosmith, for Queen, for Bad Company, as I mentioned in that previous video, which I did. Anyway, by the mid-70s, both of these older heavy rock and progressive bands were starting to see the end of their respective eras. Interestingly, the economic disparity in Britain at the time that spurred the punk rock movement is also said to have inspired the new heavy metal movement, as many young people who struggled to find work doing even laborious and menial jobs turned to music instead. The destitute sentiment of the times is probably what inspired the lyrics to Judas Priest's song Breaking the Law. There I was, completely wasting, out of work and down, all inside. It's so frustrating as I drift from town to town. And later on, so much for the golden future, I can't even start. I've had every promise broken, there's anger in my heart. So the earliest bands to form actually formed during this time of downturn in the British economy, and the earliest ones basically around 74, 75, those bands I feel tapped in a little bit more to the progressive rock scene, and I think I mentioned that in a previous video when I talked about Quartz's debut album. There is a bit more of a progressive feel to it rather than a punk rock feel, and of course Steve Harris of Iron Maiden also was strongly influenced by progressive rock, which is why Iron Maiden are sometimes mentioned in progressive metal conversations. But bands that formed a little bit later on, around 77, 78, when the punk rock movement was really in full swing, those bands there tend to have a little bit more of a rough edge. Especially a lot of bands, even their first albums had kind of a punk rock feel in a way, and there was also that whole DIY approach to music as well. Interestingly, during that time, there was a strong rivalry between punk rock fans and heavy metal fans. And there was a book I read about that talked about these bitter letter exchanges in a music magazine where each side was putting down the other side. And there was an amusing discussion that took place about which side had the better representative of masculinity. Was it Johnny Ramone or was it David Lee Roth? But while the bickering may have been heated between the fans, the metal musicians seemed to better recognize the attributes of punk rock music and applied them to varying degrees to heavy metal. Thus we have bands like Tank, the original recording lineup of Tigers of Pantang, and even the original Iron Maiden with Paul Di'Anno on vocals. Most people will tell you there is a punk feel to it, even though Steve Harris flatly denies that Iron Maiden had anything to do with punk rock and tried to distance themselves from it as much as possible, which I saw in a video clip in that Banger TV video I mentioned. Okay, so now I'd like to talk about the albums that I have in my collection. This is not meant to be a top 25 or top 15 list or anything like that. This is not the best albums. These are just the albums that I have. Few of them I actually originally had on cassette back in the 80s. A lot of them I picked up just in the last 3 years or so. So let's get started. I've talked about Quartz. Their debut came out in 1977. Their second album, Stand Up and Fight, came out in 1980. Now this album, I think this is a great new wave of British heavy metal album. It basically captures the essence of what you would expect to find in a kind of broad view of the whole scene. This particular reissue here, good lord, it's hard to read with sunglasses on. But anyway, this reissue here, the sound is loud. Like, you actually have to knock the volume down a little bit if you've got the earbuds on. But it is still fairly clear. There are other recordings I'll mention where the sound is really loud and it's distorted in an unpleasant way. Quartz, however, Stand Up and Fight, this reissue here, sounds really good. If you really want to know what it is, put a question in the comments and I'll answer. Okay, one really cool band that came out, this is a band called Satan. Maybe not the best choice for a name, but hey, why not? There were other bands called Hell and Cloven Hoof and Holocaust, so why not Satan? I think they managed to release just this one album, or possibly two, and then basically they broke up for a long time before coming back together again, and then I think they've released a couple of albums since then. This, their debut album, Court in the Act, this is quite a good one, and this is a more serious heavy metal style. In fact, this is basically what I would say this is heavy metal. There are bands in the new wave of British heavy metal scene which I think now are more hard rock, but I'd say these guys here, they had the metal feel for the time, and this is actually 1983. Another band that I find quite similar, this is Jaguar Power Games. This album here also, I feel, is that more heavy metal sound, at least for the time anyway, what you probably consider classic metal now. This album here, I'm a little disappointed because the sound is a bit scratchy. You can hear it on some parts of the songs, sometimes where there's just a guitar riff and no other music going, there's this kind of scratchy echo. I don't know if it is just the version I have. If I find a version reissued on a different label, maybe the sound is better. I don't know. But anyway, the music on here is good. I would say, in a way, similar to Satan. You could certainly put them on the same shelf. So this is Jaguar Power Games. This, I think it's the third Samson album, possibly the second, but I think it's the third. This is called Shock Tactics, and I bought this one because this is one of the albums with Samson that features Bruce Dickinson on vocals, and I was very interested in hearing how he was singing with a band outside of Iron Maiden. The one thing, like, it's basically a good album, but the one thing I find is that this is more of a sleazy rock album, and there are a lot of sex songs on here. And it's kind of interesting to hear Bruce Dickinson singing with his powerful vocals, something about lovey-dovey, I took you from behind. And I'm not actually sure if that's literally like in a sexual way or if it's just simply about cheating somebody out of their money through sex. Not sure, but anyway, it is a fun rock and roll, heavy rock and roll album with Bruce Dickinson on vocals. I heard somebody say that maybe this is his best vocal performance, but I think because of the lyrics, it's really hard to imagine Bruce Dickinson, who normally sings about history or literature or science fiction in some way, singing about basically sleazy sex. Anyway, Samson, Shock Tactics. Next we have Loose and Lethal by Savage. Now this album here, as an album, as music, it is a really good heavy metal album for the time, and I think it's also 1983. The band struggling to get their debut out. A lot of bands actually didn't get a debut album out until 83 or 82. But anyway, here it is, Savage, Loose and Lethal. This is probably the worst sounding album in the collection though. It is really scratchy. There are times I listen to it and I think, well, maybe it's tolerable if I focus on the music. And then there are other times it's like, this is unbearable. I hate to hear good quality music sounding so poorly. I'm not talking about a lo-fi recording. There's a difference between a lo-fi recording and a really crappy mastering job, and I feel the mastering has just been pushed through the roof. Even in that video with Martin Popoff and Pete Pardo mentions the sound quality on here, but he says he felt it kind of works with the style of the music. I find it very disappointing, and so I only come to this album a few times every once in a while and usually end up feeling disappointed again. So somebody really needs to release this album with a good quality mastering and not this loud, scratchy sound. It's like cranking it on a cheap transistor radio. Here's another album that I have a bit of problems with the sound quality. This is Tank, Filth Hounds of Hades, their debut album. Again, we're talking about a kind of scratchy sound on it, which I feel detracts from the music. The music it's good. It's kind of heavy metal fused with punk in a way. The vocals certainly have a more punk sound, I find, but really fun stuff to listen to. Just there's this scratchiness that comes in the recording, which I think shouldn't be there. So once again, maybe, let's see, this is released on Heavy Sounds. Maybe I need to find Okay, well that was a bit horrendous. Sorry, I had to pause the video there for a bit. I suddenly had a terrible sneezing fit, and I was in no position to continue with the video. In fact, I looked like this. Right, and so now here I am without my sunglasses on. Did I mention those sunglasses were actually part of my Halloween costume 2 years ago? I looked like this. Good day. Music is a Journey episode 10 is about to begin. Okay, so now let's get on with the rest of the albums I wanted to introduce for the new wave of British heavy metal scene. I finished talking about Tank, right? Okay, a pretty good, solid, fun, hard rocking album, heavy rock album, bit of a punk sound to it, but yeah, good stuff. I haven't heard any of their other stuff, so might want to check that out. As I said, a little disappointed with the sound, the remastering I guess it is, for that one that I have. Bit loud and scratchy. So moving on, here's one I am not disappointed with. This is the Tigers of Pantang, Wildcat, the debut album by this band. Now I forgot to check who the vocalist was. Just a moment, I'm going to freeze the video while I check. Jess Cox is the vocalist on this album here, and I think he only did the one album and then they changed to another vocalist. But this was my first Tigers of Pantang album. I bought it just like 3 years ago. It's really good. I really like this. I like the sound of the vocal style as well. So yeah, I know their next couple of albums are the ones that are the most popular ones, but I really like this album here. And just because they mentioned it on that video with Martin Popoff and Pete Pardo, I went ahead and ordered Tigers of Pantang Crazy Nights, their third album, with... Okay, I'm afraid the print is really too small. I can just barely make it out. Looks like Joe somebody. So I'll just put the name down at the bottom there. Okay. Yeah, this album is also really good and quite different. This actually reminds me a little bit more of Saxon, in a way. Like 25% Def Leppard, 75% Saxon, something like that. But anyway, yeah, this is also a really cool album. I'm glad I got it. So, pays to watch other people's videos. Well, it doesn't pay because you end up spending money buying more albums, which is what I end up doing all the time. However, I get to know about some good stuff, which is why I make my videos. In case you don't know about some of this stuff, maybe you want to check it out. All right, this one here is pretty cool. This is Witchfinder General, Death Penalty. This album here, often said to be one of the first, or if not the first, doom metal band. I believe this album is from 1982. Probably. It is 1982. All right. Yeah, and there is a really strong Sabbath sound on here. A lot of the riffs, the guitar sound, even the vocal style is similar to that classic Black Sabbath sound, but pretty cool. And yeah, all right, if you want to say this is where doom metal kicks off for the new generation, I say it's a pretty good contender. I like this album. Alright, now here's a band, one of the few bands that I actually knew were of the new wave of British heavy metal scene. This is Raven. This is their fourth album, All for One. I believe it's 1983, probably. I think I mentioned it in my 1983 video. Udo Dirkschneider sings guest vocals on here. What's his name here? Mark Gallagher, John Gallagher. Who's the vocalist? Somebody knows that. Anyway, honestly, I have never been a big fan of the vocals. The high-pitched screams are good, but just the regular vocals, it sounds to me like it's being pitched from constricted back of the throat here, and I don't know. I can't do it, but I can feel how it must sound. I've never been big on that vocal style. Sorry. But, of course, it is a rousing, rocking album. Raven, sometimes credited as being one of the early, I don't know, progenitors of speed metal. I don't quite hear it, but okay, maybe close. Again, though, I have a problem with this album, and that is, one more time, scratchy remastering. And this video is slowly starting to turn into that scratchy remastering video I keep talking about. But there you go, Raven all for one. Angel Witch. Now, Angel Witch was when I first decided, hey, let's check out more new wave of British heavy metal bands. Angel Witch was one of the first ones I brought home, and I was really impressed. It's like, dude, I missed all this? Wow, this is a heavy band. There is some Sabbath influence, but overall, I think they have their own sound, and it's just a really good, solid, heavy metal album. Are we talking 1979 or 1980? Doesn't say, it just says 2006 on the back. Oh well. Anyway, yeah, Angel Witch. And they unfortunately had a really rough time trying to make the big time. And I think they went off to the US. They tried to join in with the thrash scene somewhat. I don't know. They had a lot of problems, but this is a really good album here. And this one here has all these like bonus tracks on as well. Other singles, 7-inch singles, and live recordings with the BBC. So that's pretty cool. Okay, one of those very important albums in the new wave of British heavy metal, Diamond Head's White Album, or Lightning to the Nations. Does it show the Lightning to the Nations cover on the inside? Probably it doesn't here somewhere. But anyway, yeah. This is, well, because of the song Am I Evil, which Metallica covered, and I believe they're still playing to this day, Diamond Head kind of got an extra kick towards fame there in the 1980s. Apparently, they keep changing their sound album to album. I saw one of their albums with a really cool cover, went to check it out, and I was just thinking, it doesn't sound like this album, though. It's really different. But anyway, yeah, lots of cool stuff on here. And that's Diamond Head. Lightning to the Nations, or the White Album. Disc 1, the White Album. Disc 2, the singles. Lightning to the Nations, the White Album. Well, alright, it has 2 names. Okay, now a band that I actually was into way back in the day, in my junior high school days. Da 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 da! Venom! Welcome to Hell and Black Metal, which I have now on CD. I think I had the first 4 albums plus a special EP, Canadian Assault or something like this on cassette, which I think was my first Venom purchase anyway. But yeah, what can we say? I mean, these guys, they're speed metal, they're early thrash, they're like the first ideas coming into black metal. They even got the name black metal. Some people will say this is where the black metal scene started. Other people will say, no, it's not true. But anyway, Welcome to Hell and Black Metal. I don't know which one I like more. There are songs I like on both. But anyway, Venom, just one of those really important bands. And yeah, oh look at that. It says right in there, NWoBHM, NWoBHM. Yeah, cool. Okay, and we're coming now to the end of it, I can tell, because now we're talking about the bands that I actually knew. And I bought this special, the career years, 1979 to 1984, Saxon. So this includes their first 6 albums, plus some bonus track stuff here as well. I had the 2nd through to the 6th album. Did not have the debut, but yeah, they're all here. What the heck? Why does it look like 7 albums? Oh, there's some live album on here as well, I guess. Maybe. Or not. I don't know. Anyway, yeah, I wasn't like a tremendously huge Saxon fan, but I still ended up with 5 of their albums. And each album always had one song that I really liked, and then about 2 or 3 others that I thought were really great. And I remember Taking Your Chances, which I believe is from the Strong Arm of the Law album. I really liked that one. That guitar sound and the riff, just something about it really grabbed me. I liked The Eagle Has Landed. Crusader was actually the first album of theirs I bought, so I liked a lot of tracks off that. Heavy Metal Thunder. I mean, overall, there's just such a great selection of Saxon songs on here. So this was much cheaper than buying 6 individual CDs. Got everything. Cool. So coming down to the end, well, of course, Def Leppard's Pyromania, that was one of the first, probably one of the first 10 to 12 albums I ever bought on cassette way back when. And I remember how I got it too. I was at a sandcastle building contest down at White Rock Beach, which is near my hometown of Surrey, which is near Vancouver. Anyway, and I found $20. And I said to my mom, Mom, I just found $20. She said, "Shh, don't say anything. Everybody will say it's theirs." So, put it in my pocket, and I was allowed to go to the store and buy a couple of cassettes. So, one of them was Def Leppard's Pyromania. I bought that on cassette with that $20 I found, as well as a Judas Priest album. But yeah, so Def Leppard, I actually had High and Dry back in the day. I just recently bought it again because both Martin Popoff and Pete Pardo were saying what a great album it was. They both included it on their list. So I thought, okay, I gotta hear it again. And yeah, it is quite good, but you can definitely hear the Mutt Lange production leading the way towards Pyromania on this. Their debut album, On Through the Night, does not have that sound. And in a way, I actually prefer this one. Maybe because the really polished sound of Pyromania was really good at the time. Now it's, I don't know, what do you want to call it? A kind of, I don't know, what do you want to call it? It seems like a kind of anachronism now, something like that. But anyway, yeah, On Through the Night. You know, a funny thing, there used to be this program on the radio called Your Own Radio Show, and I don't know where it was from, if it was from the US or something, but it was played on the Vancouver rock station, and Your Own Radio Show. And I remember these two guys going on, and they were playing all these kind of like metal tunes there back in 83, 84 or whatever. And they were telling you how to be slick in between the songs. And I remember, for example, they said, put on your tightest pair of jeans, take a deep breath, and sit down. You did that? Okay, the jeans aren't tight enough. So they were putting in all these little jokes in between the songs. But I remember they said they were going to play Def Leppard, and they started playing something from Pyromania. Then they stopped and they said, no, let's play something from the real Def Leppard. And I believe they picked something from On Through the Night. So anyway, and it looks like we are down to the last band to talk about. What more can you say about Iron Maiden? Here's their debut album with the new version, The Red Eyes. This was the first Iron Maiden album I bought. I still love it. Number of the Beast was the second one I bought. Yeah, huge band. This is probably my favorite Iron Maiden album. Peace of Mind came out in 1983. Of course, by 1983, coming to the end of the new wave of British heavy metal period, Iron Maiden already have 4 albums out, plus the Made in Japan EP, right? A lot of bands already having several albums out by that time. But anyway, there it is. So that is a list of the new wave of British heavy metal bands I have. I did order Tokyo Blade's debut album. Hasn't arrived yet. I've had my eye on Girls' School for probably about 3 years now, and I just still haven't ordered any of their albums yet. Anyway, okay, so that's it. No more talking. New wave of British heavy metal. Those 15 bands. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video. Bye. Got through that one. No sneezing. No red eyes. Yay.